Thanks so much, Anne-Marie. That was, you know, we really, nobody can accuse the Lucas Linton Prizes of giving our awards to cat books or something of that kind. We have very cheery subject matter. Jim Crow's segregation, Nagasaki, and concentration camps. But it's hard to imagine any more important or more in need of the kind of illumination and just astonishing capacity to synthesize and to shed light on very complex subjects as we have represented today. So what I'm going to do is talk for a little bit to each author and then ask them some questions about things they have in common, and then we're going to open it up to you. But I hope we're going to be able to take people into the process of writing these books. There's a lot of places where authors can go and talk about what's in their books, but how they did it is part of what I hope we can talk about a little bit today. And we're going to start with Steve Luxenberg. The Work in Progress Award is really central to what this foundation is dedicated to, nurturing the life of nonfiction in our culture. Without narrative nonfiction, it's very hard for, I think, any of us to understand how we're going to not just understand history, but also understand current problems. So that's what we're about. And anybody out there who wants to support this mission, that's my pitch. Now, Steve, you went, to give an example of why this took longer than you anticipated, and my understanding is you anticipated your book to be completed 2 years ago, right? And when you told your publisher, right?
Have you been talking to my editor?
This is important. This is important because the reason that it took so long, as I understand it,
because I'm slow?
No, what I understand is that you actually chose a topic where you willfully, disobeyed the commands of an editor about what the nature of your topic should be. Explain.
Well, it wasn't my editor. I would never diss my own editor. But a previous editor had said to me, never choose an arc of history that lasts 70 years, because all you're doing is making yourself responsible for understanding so many different eras in American history that you'll never be able to finish it. I thought, I can do it. But it makes it very difficult because I'm hardly an expert in one era of American history. To be an expert in all of those eras is an impossible challenge, and so you have to separate out what avenues you want to go down and what roads you don't want to go down. And unfortunately, I seem to choose too many roads.
But, well, no, not unfortunately, because the book, which is mostly complete now, integrates those eras from the 1850s to the 20th century quite brilliantly. But the question at the center of it all is, why was this particular Supreme Court case so significant?
Well, I felt it wasn't an untold story, and I basically look at subtitles like that and reject them because publishers like them and authors cringe at them. Somebody has told the story in some way. I like to think of David McCullough's essay to his second book about the Brooklyn Bridge, and he tells the story in the essay about how he chose the topic, and he rushed off to the New York Public Library after having the idea after a lunch with an architect and an engineer, and he looked up in the card catalog in the pre-internet days, and he only found 100 other books about the Brooklyn Bridge, but none were the book he wanted to write. Nobody seems to have told the story from the narrative nonfiction point of view, which is the one thing I think I have some talent at. And I wrote to a couple of professors to ask them about this before I launched on it 5 years ago. And I was gratified to learn that he too agreed, after talking to another group of historians, that while the story has been told from a legal point of view, from a constitutional history point of view, it hasn't been told from the very human point of view that I wanted to tell it from. And some of my characters have had biographies written about them, but at least two have not. And so I feel like I'm bringing that kind of illumination to their lives. And I'm interested, as the citation said, in the ironies and the contradictions. The justice who wrote the decision came from a kind of abolitionist neck of the woods when he grew up, and he ends up writing the decision that is now reviled.
Well, Justice Brown was from Massachusetts.
He was from Massachusetts. He was raised in Connecticut. He had quite a liberal upbringing, if you will, a word that wasn't really used back then. Justice Harlan, on the other hand, was the only Southerner on the court who owned slaves in his lifetime. He inherited some during the Civil War from his father, who had just died. And yet he ends up writing the dissent that is now praised. How does that occur? And those are the kinds of questions that I was interested in answering.
Well, how does it occur?
How does what occur?
How does it occur that the Northern abolition? Well, when you go on book tour, when your book's done, you're going to find that you have to telescope it for television. So,
but I go on book tour, I'm going to direct the conversation in another direction.
What is?
Well, I think that historians sometimes make the mistake, at least I feel that I've read some histories this way. We know the outcome of this case. And so a lot of people go back and they look for what I call the seeds that were planted early in someone's life that explain to us how he or she behaved during their lifetime. I think a better way to look at it is the evolution of their lifetime. How did they react to the impulses, the effects, the environment that they lived in? Harlan, you cannot excuse Harlan's pro-slavery views in his 1859 congressional campaign. You can't explain them. That's what he believed. But there are some histories that try to treat Harlan's view as one that was almost created because he had to have that view in order to get elected. He didn't win his election, his campaign, by the way. I don't think that's true. I think he was pro-slavery in 1859. So I'm interested in understanding how he evolved from that point of view. He evolved by living his life and reacting to the things that pushed on him, the things that confronted him. The fact that there was no other way to be in Kentucky than to be a Democrat or a Republican. He had been a third-party man for so many years, and he was tired of losing. And so he became a Republican, and once he became a Republican, he went in with both feet.
So a relatively pragmatic political decision did something to his whole conception of what it meant to be an American. Because for him to say that separate was unequal was a pretty profound decision.
It was. Although the discussion about race in the 19th century in my research shows me that there was much more of a lively conversation than people would have thought. It was right out there, if you will, in the newspapers, and that they were more honest about their racial views in the 1860s and 70s than we are today. We want to shy away from the discussion of race for the most part. They did not shy away from the discussion of race. It was part of their life every day because they had important decisions to make. There were 4 civil rights acts passed between 1866 and 1875. 4 civil rights acts. The language of those acts were as modern as the language of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They dealt with public accommodations. They dealt with suffrage. They dealt with being able to go to theaters. They dealt with railroads. The Severed Railroad Car Act that becomes the heart of Plessy versus Ferguson was passed in 1890, not in 1865. And it was the first of 3 such states that did this in the 1888-1890 period. It took until 1906 for South Carolina to pass the same kind of act. So they didn't all rush to do separate societies.
A commenter in that period said that the majority in the case was too bound by precedent to see the future. So had there been a bunch of cases that these abolitionist Northerners on the
We're going to talk about the writing process here.
Well, no, I'm interested, in both. So, I mean, were they
The Supreme Court begins to narrow the definition of the 14th Amendment, starting in the slaughterhouse cases in the early 1870s. If they had ruled the other way in Plessy, it would have reversed 20 years of what they had been doing. Now, it wasn't the same court, there were different justices, but it would have reversed 20 years of precedence, if you will. I don't know that they were too bound by precedent. That sounds like somebody who would like them to come to a different conclusion. They thought what their conclusion was about the 14th Amendment was correct. We'd like to think that they were just wrong or bad, but they thought they were correct.
So just to back up for a second before we move on, who was Homer Plessy and why was he at the center of the case?
Homer Plessy was the second of two young men selected to enter the white car on two different Louisiana railroads in preparation for the test case that was going to go to the Supreme Court if the strategist could engineer it. He was not arrested or manhandled as a result of an accident. The railroad was in on it. They wanted to test the case because they didn't have to have separate railroad cars. They could have fewer railroad cars. It would be less expensive for them. If they were going to have separate railroad cars, they wanted to know how many they were supposed to have. So they had agreed to the arrest. And Plessy knew that he would be arrested. The reason he was the second of two test cases is that they kind of screwed the first one up. The first one, they won. The state Supreme Court in Louisiana said that you couldn't cross state lines with a separate railroad car, therefore you couldn't tell Mississippi or Alabama how they should design their railroad cars if it was an interstate railroad. And then the lawyers for Plessy looked at the ruling and said, well, gosh, that means that a railroad that stays within the state can have separate railroad cars.
So Plessy had to actually say, even though I look white, I'm black in order to move the case? Or he had to somehow create that situation so that...
The conductor knew that he was supposed to arrest him. Plessy was chosen in part because he looked white, and the lawyers wanted to argue that you can't enforce a law in which you cannot tell the color of the people that you are being asked to separate. This man looks white. If he's in the black car, then what is he doing there?
So before we go back to process and move on to our next author, who was Albion Tourguet and why might he be a kind of a glimpse of the future and our world today?
Well, Albion Tourguet was born in Eastern Ohio in what was called the Western Reserve. He was the most famous white advocate for civil rights in America by the 1890s. He was a best-selling author of novels that were Reconstruction novels set in North Carolina, where he had moved as a young man, determined to make the Civil War become real, to finish the job. He was a carpetbagger in the views of people in the South. He left there basically run out of town because of his activities.
So he was what students here would call a social justice warrior?
He'd like that term, I think, if he were alive today.
Okay.
And he ends up in the case somewhat by accident. There's a committee in New Orleans, and I would say that the only city in the country that this case could logically come from would have been New Orleans, because there wasn't a wealthy, educated class of black individuals in Charleston, Richmond, Savannah yet. But in New Orleans, this mixed race group, which had been free before the Civil War, after the Civil War, instead of being regarded as kind of a third class, became, quote, black. And they didn't much like it, because to be black was worse than being white. So by the time this law came along, they were loaded for bear. They wanted to go off. And they were very subtle about it. They formed a group. They called themselves the Committee Committee to Challenge the Constitutionality of the Separate Car Law. That was on their letterhead.
So So it was another 60 years before Brown versus Board of Education, and a tremendous amount of Jim Crow segregation legislation that went through as a result of this case. So we know how seminal a moment it was in American history.
And thank God I'm not doing that 60 years as well.
Right.